What if the Tower of Babel was never confounded? Imagine the world breathing with one voice. Imagine a city that doesn't just rise from a plane, but reaches into the story itself. A staircase of clay and sunlight where every worker can call out to every other, and no one needs translation. Imagine news moving as fast as people can carry it, ideas flying further than birds, and a giant spine of brick and bitumen threading heaven and earth while the air itself hums with agreement. That is the image that sits behind our question tonight. And it is a question about more than bricks, more than a tower. It is a question about the gift and danger of understanding. Before we step into the alternate, we should retell the beginning. In the book of Genesis, after the flood and the survival of Noah's family, people moved east and settled on a broad, flat land called Shinar. There they discovered something practical and powerful: fired bricks. "Let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly," they said. And with mortar, they laid their ambitions out in courses. They decided, "Let us build a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered over the face of the whole earth." It was a project of unity and pride, a bright promise and a dark impulse braided together. The story tells us that God looked upon this concentrated power and said, "Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do." The response was not lightning, but language. The tongues of the builders were confounded, speech fractured like light in a prism, and the project stalled. People drifted into separate groups and places, carrying new words and new worlds inside them. The place became known as Babel, a name echoing both Babylon and the confusion of Babel. Now, let us move carefully into the yes of our question. What if that confounding did not happen? What if the city remained a city of one language, one shared vocabulary, one grammar of thought, and the tower's shadow lengthened across generations? This is not doctrine. It is a respectful thought experiment, a lens we hold up to better see the role of language in our lives and faith. The first difference unfolds at the speed of a voice carrying through a crowd. Without language splintering, the city remains a magnet. People who would have turned away in frustration instead stay and argue, plan, and sing in the same words. The tower rises, maybe not to scrape clouds, but to become a giant terrace, a stepped mountain of humanity. You can picture them. Masons passing bricks hand to hand, architects scratching measurements into clay tablets, children racing along safe, wide ramps while priests and administrators debate on shaded platforms about grain stores, river levels, and the next festival. The tower is not just height, it is a system, and language oils every gear. Very quickly, the city would likely standardize more than brick sizes. Measures become shared, weights become reliable. A common set of symbols spreads from tablet to tablet, one script, refined and taught in schools with uniform strokes. The earliest lists we know from ancient Mesopotamia catalog cattle, grain, and taxes. In a single language world, these lists travel, and with them travel methods. A tax reform in the city becomes a tax reform in the villages. A clever way to divert water in one canal becomes a way to save crops 100 miles away. Merchants talk with shepherds, talk with scholars, talk with fishers, and their words bind them together. We would probably see an earlier and more stable super-kingdom, not because one person is necessarily more talented, but because the glue of language makes administration easier. You can imagine a ruler, or perhaps a council, issuing edicts that are read and understood the same way everywhere. Not perfect understanding. No word is ever immune to nuance, sarcasm, or local humor, but close enough to produce the strange miracle of coordination. With that coordination comes speed. New ideas don't need to be translated. They are immediately debated. Knowledge doesn't bottleneck in one region. It spills across roads and rivers. Knowledge is one thing. Power is another. Anyone who has ever found themselves in a team where everyone agrees too quickly knows that unity can be exhilarating and dangerous. A single language removes one of the great frictions of empire: misunderstanding. Without that friction, a city can expand until it must ask itself other questions. How much labor can be organized? How much time is given to work? And how much to rest? How do you keep safety in a city that never stops building? Somewhere in these early years, a wise scribe, or a worried grandmother, might propose a law that says no tower can grow unless it also builds schools and gardens at its base. Such a law would be easy to explain and defend when everyone can hear the same argument. You might think differences would evaporate. They won't. Even in one language, people tell stories that stretch in different directions. One neighborhood loves the old festival songs. Another writes new tunes. One market prefers spiced stews. Another gathers around salt-grilled fish. Taste diverges, and with it, culture. But the bridges between districts stay intact because the conversation never stops. You can picture the city hosting a fair of accents, a playful event where people mimic their own slant on vowels and laugh together not because they cannot understand, but because they can. In this closeness, folktales and proverbs begin to travel like windborne seeds. Some sprout into shared wisdom. Others become weeds that must be pulled. And because the language does not fragment into mutually unintelligible branches, the sciences of pattern, mathematics, astronomy, surveying, move along a single riverbed instead of splitting into a delta. The base 60 traces of the real Mesopotamian tradition, where a circle is 360 degrees and an hour is 60 minutes, might settle deeper and wider. A single set of numerals, taught to every child on clay abacuses, allows for quicker, more widespread calculation. The tower's upper terraces could double as observatories. Up there, above smoke and chatter, a ring of apprentices learns to track the motion of planets with strings and pegs. Eyes turn upward, and the language weaves new words. Terms for angles, for shadows, for time. Outside the city, caravans lengthen. Camels and wagons carry goods and stories on roads graded not only with stones but with standards. Way stations post written notices everyone can read. How many days to the next river crossing? Which routes are safe after the spring thaw? A farmer in a distant valley writes to the city and receives an answer that makes sense the first time he reads it. The simple miracle of a letter that works everywhere begins to flatten distance. There is a shadow in all this light, and it's not only the towers. In a one-language world, propaganda needs only to be clever once. A lie can run fast, too. If a ruler decides to bend truth toward himself, there are fewer cracks in which dissent can nest and grow. Censorship becomes efficient. Reforms, if resisted at the top, must be argued at a fierce wind. Yet the reverse is also true. A good idea does not have to fight uphill against translation. One eloquent speech can protect a poor district, and one clear poem can shame a tyrant. The stakes rise because the medium is universal. Faith in this world is a conversation conducted in daylight. In the canonical timeline, the scattering of languages produces many religious streams and strands of meaning. In our speculative city, names for God travel and fuse. Local deities and high gods rub shoulders and exchange titles. It is possible that monotheistic ideas emerge earlier, not because a council forces them, but because a single argument can be carried from sanctuary to sanctuary without being broken by unfamiliar words. The God of heaven is debated in the same syllables under different skies. Abraham, if he still hears a call in this world, and perhaps he does, because calls are stubborn, will find his journey easier in one sense and harder in another. Easier because wherever he roams he can speak plainly. Harder because everywhere he goes people can argue back in the same language. And the pressure to conform is heavy when the empire's words are the only words in town. The promise of a people, the idea of blessing and covenant, still has room to grow. But it must do so in soil that is shared by everyone. Prophets in such a world would be very loud and very clear, or very quiet and piercing. Their poems would not need translators, only ears. If the story of Moses arrives in this thread of history, it arrives in a world where oppression and liberation are negotiated in a language both sides share. The plagues would be announced with terrifying clarity, the demands understood perfectly, the law given in words that travel along well-worn roads as fast as tablets can be copied. Ironically, the commandments, whoever first inscribed them, would be legible to more people sooner. What that does to religion is complex. It could deepen understanding or flatten it, depending on the humility of the readers. On the third terrace of the tower, a group of children learns to map the world. Their teacher draws coastlines with a reed and says, "If you want to walk to the sea, follow this river." The maps are copied and corrected. Errors do not multiply quietly in distant places where nobody can read the original. A single cartographic language makes journeys safer, trade wider, and perhaps, dangerously, makes conquest more tempting. If you know exactly where a mountain pass lies, you no longer fear it. You simply march. Midway through this thought experiment, let me turn this into a conversation with you. If you lived in a one-language world, what is one law or custom you would want in place to keep unity from becoming control? If you enjoy these respectful what-if journeys through history and faith, help us build this little corner of the internet by subscribing and leaving a like. It lets us make more of them. Back to the tower. It would need to become more than a workplace. If it continued to rise, the people would learn the physics of their own ambition. They would discover wind. They would notice how weight shifts when too many gather on an upper platform. They might invent, centuries early, the simple devices that make great buildings safe. A kind of lightning rod after a terrifying storm, a drainage system after a flood, counterweights for hoisting. Human expertise grows when a problem refuses to move, and the tower does not move. It teaches. Alongside expertise, the presence of a universal language has a strange effect on art. Epics are not regional treasures. They are everyone's bedtime story. A single tale of a hero who turned away from the tower to find a truer mountain is told in the same cadence in port towns and hill villages. Songs about humility spread like lantern light, balancing the story of making a name with wiser counsel about the value of small names, of quiet work, of families and fields. In a scattered world, difference protects us from the dominance of one melody. In a unified world, the same chorus can become a lullaby or a marching tune depending on who beats the drum. We sometimes imagine that language diversity is the same as cultural diversity. They overlap, but are not identical. Even with one set of words, people rearrange meaning. The city learns this the hard way when a drought hits. The same decree about rationing is heard two ways, as care in one neighborhood and as control in another. In response, elders invent a new practice. Public readings, followed by public questioning. Anyone may step forward and ask what a phrase means. The language is unified, but understanding is still an active verb. This, too, is part of the lesson of Babel. The risk is not merely that we will fail to understand each other, but that we will stop trying. The greatest library of this world might stand not by the sea, but within the tower's base. A cool, fragrant archive with shelves of tablets and later, smoother leaves of inked fiber. A worker from a distant farm can enter and read the oldest laws in the same script that taught her letters. She finds a line about protecting the poor from exploitation and realizes it applies to her mother. She copies it down, takes it to a magistrate, speaks in her own voice, and something changes. When knowledge needs no translator, justice gets a little faster and sometimes a little braver. Yet there are pitfalls to all forms of speed. The same library can ossify into a temple of the one way to say truth. Certain schools can become gatekeepers of what counts as thought. A single language can create a choke point, which is why, even here, children invent slang and poets bend grammar. They are not vandalizing the language, they are oxygenating it. Without such play, words calcify into power. There is a historical irony we cannot ignore. In the story of the early church, a moment called Pentecost describes people suddenly able to understand each other across language boundaries. In our speculative timeline, where one language is already the norm, the miracle would not be in vocabulary. It might be in listening itself. The sudden capacity to hear old words as if they were new, to forgive an enemy in the same tongue, to turn a public square into a place of shared conscience. Instead of the flash of translation, perhaps the wonder would be the tenderness of understanding that goes beyond the dictionary. That is another kind of miracle, quieter and possibly harder. What of discovery beyond familiar coasts? With universal words for latitude and wind, with standardized units and a shared tradition of map-making, bold sailors and caravan masters would push further, sooner. When they meet new peoples and lands, the first barrier is not language, but trust. Trade partners exchange goods and stories in a tongue both have learned from traders long before. Misunderstandings do not vanish, but they are different. The dangers of disease and the inequities of power travel too, and perhaps the only real defense is not in the clarity of speech, but in the character of those who speak. Inside such expansion, the tower remains as a symbol, both admired and questioned. Some want it taller, others want it repurposed. Eventually, a group of citizens proposes a transformation. The upper platforms become gardens and observatories, the middle becomes schools and courts, The base becomes an open market where the taxes generated directly fund the care of widows, orphans, and travelers. They argue that the tower's meaning should evolve from "let us make a name" to "let us make a home." The beauty of a shared language is that this argument can be carried to every doorstep, and families can decide whether to support it without waiting for a translator. Would war be rarer? Perhaps not. Human beings can disagree convincingly in any language. But diplomacy has fewer hurdles. Treaties can be written once and read everywhere without ambassadors sweating over clauses that change flavor in different tongues. Standing armies are easier to coordinate, for good or ill. Spies must work harder because eavesdropping is easy. Peace may still swing on the hinge of humility more than on clarity of text. Technology would huddle around the campfire of language and warm its hands. Agricultural techniques would spread in seasons instead of generations. Simple machines, pulleys, levers, screws, would be understood broadly, their principles taught in village schools. The craft of numeracy would likely walk hand in hand with the art of story, because teachers who can reach the whole civilization will blend beauty with instruction to keep attention. The concept of nothingness, zero, that tiny revolution, might be debated earlier. When ideas travel fast through one tongue, some are rejected quickly and then return when the soil is ready. Others take root at once and grow forests. In medicine, herbal knowledge would be pooled, patterns and symptoms recognized across regions, and remedies refined with shared records. The first public health measures would be written and posted in words everyone understands. How to boil water. How to avoid contaminated wells during floods. How to care for the sick without becoming sick yourself. The mortality of childbirth, of infection, of famine, still high, still terrifying, might bend sooner as sensible practices become communal habits instead of isolated wisdom. And yet, if this all sounds too smooth, remember the human tendency to build towers out of anything, including language itself. We stack words to the sky and then forget to look at the people at our feet. A one-language world is not automatically kinder. It can be unified and cruel. It can be efficient and unjust. The key difference is that excuses are harder. "I didn't understand" doesn't work as well when you share a mother tongue with your neighbor. There is one more lens we should hold up to our alternate city. What happens to prayer? In a scattered world, people pray in many languages, and something about that chorus feels like a field of wildflowers, varied, beautiful, messy. In our city, the prayers bend toward a common rhythm and vocabulary. This can be consoling, a whole people speaking to God with one song. It can also be dangerous if it convinces us that God belongs to our grammar. The first humility, in any world, is remembering that our words, though precious, are small boats on a vast sea. Years pass. The tower does not touch heaven, but the people discover something truer. Heaven touches them when they feed the hungry, when they forgive quickly, when they admit they were wrong and change course. The great unified language carries these stories, and mothers teach them to sons with the same words that teachers use in schools. In the cadence of that teaching, the city grows wiser. Not perfect. Never perfect. Wiser. It helps, at the end of a long imagining, to step back to our own world and close the loop with gratitude. Our world is a tangle of tongues. The scattering at Babel, whether you read it as history, myth, warning, or some blend, left us with a mosaic that can be frustrating and beautiful. We know the sting of translation that loses a joke, and the wonder of a phrase that slips across languages like light. We know the loneliness of not being understood, and the relief when someone meets us halfway. The story of Babel can be read as a caution against pride and a blessing on diversity. Our alternate city shows us both sides of the coin. One language can accelerate good and consolidate harm. Many languages can slow the harm and sometimes the good. Either way, the virtue we most need is not clever speech, but humility. So what if the Tower of Babel was never confounded? Perhaps we would have built a taller city and learned faster how to strengthen walls against wind. Perhaps we would have organized justice sooner and organized oppression more efficiently. Perhaps we would have discovered that the tower we really needed to build was the invisible one made of habits, kindness, patience, curiosity. In that world, as in ours, the tallest structures are invisible. They are the ways we choose to use whatever words we share. This has been a speculative window, a respectful walk along a different path to see our own more clearly. Whether you pray, study, or simply think about ancient tales, may this story turn your attention to the bridges inside your day. Thank the person who translates for you. Listen harder to the neighbor you can already understand. And if you ever find yourself wanting to make a name, try making a welcome first. The city we all long for may not be a tower at all, but a table with room for everyone to sit and speak.